Perhaps the most common question surrounding Norwich City in the last 6 months or so has been the involvement of that man behind us there, Mark Attanasio, and I guess the newly created shares, which aren't that newly created now. They were created back in February, and the question that's been asked to myself, I'm sure you, Paddy, have had it a lot on Q&As as well, is what's happening? What's going to happen with these shares? Well, we're now in a position where we can talk you through it. This is I think we can call this an emergency edition of the Pinkin.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy Davitt to chat everything share related from the news that Norwich City have just announced, which is surrounding the next stage of this man's involvement in the football club, which is about to intensify, which is why it explains a slightly ad hoc setting. Paddy, this is really interesting, as we say. It's a story that we broke initially, that we've kind of kept across ever since it's evolved in the last year or so. Just talk to us about the details, what is actually happening at this next stage of events.
Yeah, we'll probably need to do a little bit of backtracking, don't we, Connor? Because we are now in September. Yeah, I'm losing track. Yeah. When this news is confirmed, we're recording just towards the end of the transfer window. But it's going back to February and the allotment process, which was essentially shareholders asked to vote by proxy to allow some tweaks and changes to some of the amendments and the articles governing how the club are run. And obviously the direct element of that was what it meant in terms of potentially the creation of this rather specific figure of 194,000 shares and who they were destined for. I think we probably could all put two and two together given the backstory to that point and obviously the prominence of the chap behind us. But so at that point there was an expectation that, as it did, I think they were all voted through, wasn't they? I think Delia and Michael, as they were then, the majority shareholders, I think their votes pretty much carried it anyway, irrespective of what the smallest shareholders in terms of actual volume of shares were going to vote on. So from that point, it has gone very quiet. And really, it was probably only, certainly publicly, and it was only Zoe Webber, we were there, Radio Norfolk hosted fans forum before the start of the season at the forum in Norwich, was asked about it and explained that essentially they were being, as a club, bound by, because they are a PLC, and we don't really want to get into too much technical jargon. And essentially that's why we thought we'd do this today, to try and break down some of the documentation that's probably already landed on shareholders' doormats by now. But essentially that there were so many hurdles and procedures that they had to adhere to with these outside regulators, for want of a better word, that was essentially not in their hands in terms of when they moved to the next stage, which was where we are today, which is, communicating with their shareholders that there will be another shareholder gathering with a vote. And obviously, as I say, we'll get into it in due course, but essentially, in layman's terms, that process then will allow them essentially to ratify what was agreed or in principle back in February with the allotment of those shares. It will almost facilitate the allotment of those shares going to Mark Attanasio and his family, which will then, as it stands at that point in terms of the shareholder mix, mean we have 40% for the Attanasio group, 40% for Delia and Michael, and then 20% for the thousands of other collectively individual smallholders. So essentially it will signify the era or the end of the era of majority ownership, and that moving forward, and we'll get into a little bit more of the detail around it, what it means in the here and now, but also more importantly maybe moving forward in the next 2 to 3 years and beyond. But essentially it will mean that we now have two parties with equal ownership of shares of Norwich City Football Club, subject to, of course, this latest shareholder meeting in terms of a vote going the way that the club would like it to go.
Yeah, and that is the headline figure, really. We can no longer refer to Norwich City as having a majority shareholder. They are now minority owned by, as Paddy says, two parties. That is the headline figure. I think it's important we do a little bit of background, because it's been a long period of time since we broke this story to get to where we are now. So let's do that. And it was September last year, wasn't it, or around August, September last year, where Mark Attanasio's involvement was formally confirmed by Norwich City after, I think we reported it in May. and it had started initially, I think the initial contact at the start of 2022, as it was then. That's obviously progressed. He became a director, and let's take it up from there, Paddy, from the involvement of these new shares, and let's fill in the colour, I guess, as to how we've got to this stage. So Mark Attanasio at this stage is a board member. He attends board meetings. He has a stakeholding in the club after purchasing shares from Michael Folger and numerous others as well to push that up. He also has some sort of C preference shares as well, which can be activated and turned into normal shares as I will call them, to put it very simply, on the event of some trigger events and various aspects as well. So basically 7 years down the line, they can be converted and it increases shareholding essentially. That's where we are at the moment. What are the events that has led to where we are now, where the football club has looked to create more shares for Mark Attanasio to purchase?
Yeah, well, as you rightly say, Connor, there's background and you've mapped out the original background that got us to the process that was then set in train in February of this year, which was the allotment of further shares. But as we understand it, at that point, so just prior to the February cycle, if we want to call it that, Mark Attanasio and his group had 22% of the shareholding, chiefly from the Folger shareholder transaction, but there was also some other buy-ups. Then, as you rightly said, £10 million of C preference shares were issued, which upon certain trigger events can convert to 10% of the ordinary shares. Again, we're very loath in this recording to get into the nuances of what a C preference share is. I mean, we've been over that ground before. You can find that out, but or ordinary shares and which ones have voting rights and which don't.
I've still got a headache from writing about it, to be honest.
So essentially, he had 22% of the club's available shares at the start of this year, plus, of course, that 10 million worth of C preference, which obviously, if there was trigger events, could see him tip that up. But the view or what moved then into the February cycle was essentially, as it's been explained to me, go back to the last set of published accounts that the club put out. It was very clear there that they were borrowing against future earnings, future revenue, be that player trading or obviously the parachute payments and the broadcast revenue that they got from coming down the last time from the Premier League. So that was very clearly mapped out, that situation. Internally, they feel that isn't anything to be alarmed about, that's just the natural process of trying to balance budgets as you sort of oscillate between Premier League finance and revenue streams and Championship, which is a huge drop off, as we know, particularly in terms of the broadcast revenue. So, as it's been explained to me, they were essentially looking at how they finance the club, the debts, obviously because of the world we're living in now with interest rates are getting higher, the debt repayments, higher interest rates. So they're looking to how they can bring in some money. And they approached Mark Attanasio with regard to could they get access to some financing at maybe a cheaper rate to the rates they had on those borrowings. As we know, his background is in financial. Yeah. And he's very successful at that as well, as we can tell. So I'm led to believe that the Attanasio response was yes, very happy to explore that and ultimately help the club financially. But he doesn't want to do it as a 22% shareholder. Why would he? Again, that's a huge commitment. He would be looking to have something that represents that in terms of his shareholding mix. So from that point onwards, they've moved forward. Delia and Michael clearly a very important part of this process. They're in agreement with that. But again, and this is for me one of the key strands of this conversation that we're having, but also the documentation that's gone out and what this meeting is and what it's striving to achieve. There's no appetite yet for there to be a transfer of ownership or transfer of control, be it from the Attanasio family or from Delia and Michael. That still is very much, from what we're led to believe, where it was when he first came on board, that it's, as Mark and his family have said, they don't really know the ins and outs of soccer, if we can use that terminology. They wanted to learn the business. They wanted to learn about Norwich City as a club, about Norwich City as a community entity. And they know fully that they have a lot to learn. So that, and that, as we're led to believe, is still their viewpoint. It's still Delia and Michael are in a position where they see themselves still as custodians of the club. They don't wish that to change dramatically in terms of, they, I don't know, hypothetically go and become life presidents or whatever and relinquish themselves of their shareholding. That's not where this process is at the moment. And as a result, with those negotiations moving in that direction, we are where we were in February, which was the creation of 194,000 shares. It is that figure because that is what brings them to parity, 40%, 40%. So that's why, if anybody was wondering either then or since, why was it 194,000 shareholding figure? It's to allow them to move ahead in a lockstep process. But and this is what now brings it right up to date, and the documentation that's gone out to shareholders, and obviously a shareholder vote that is required, is a phrase which we're going to have to get into a little bit, which is the takeover code, which relates to PLCs, and it's an independent body that oversees potential shifts in shareholding that may then require a potential shift in ownership, because obviously, from what I'm led to believe, the takeover code applies once you get beyond 30% of a shareholding, which in this instance, if Mark Attanasio at the start of the year was on 22%, and he was then to get those 194,000 ordinary shares, that takes him to 40%. 40% is above the 30% threshold. So then, and this is, I think, the point Zoe Webber was getting at in the summer, it then moves a little bit out of the control of Norwich and the pace they want to go at, to this independent body, which applies to all PLCs in this country, when a potential change in shareholder ownership, or shareholder mix, would take it above a 30% threshold, which is, in hypothetical terms, where we would get to with this. So that is essentially what's brought us from the process in February, through that process in February, and now to this process. And obviously we'll get into a little bit more depth of, why they need the vehicle of shareholders having to vote.
Yeah, and where we will get into in a moment is the takeover code, because this is the element, as you say, where they've encountered plenty of red tape, and we've spoken about this before on numerous broadcasts and numerous records. And I remember speaking about it the last time that we spoke about Mark Attanasio and the shares and where it could go in the future. But to give you a little bit more detail, this is a code which, as it says, takeover code. It kicks in when, as Paddy mapped out, a shareholder surpasses or hits 30% of a business, and therefore they are then required to make a mandatory offer to every single shareholder. So let's say I wanted to move on 30%. If Paddy had one share, I would then have to make an offer at the same rate that I purchased the rest of the shares for his share. So if you owed a share of I don't know, £2, and I bought a share for £20, I would have to, you had two shares and I bought shares for £20, I'd essentially have to offer you £40 for those two shares, because that's the rate that they're going at. So this is where it gets a little bit specific, and why suddenly we begin to encounter why the red tape has been so thick for Norwich City to navigate. So just talk to us about this process, Paddy, and why the club are keen to avoid this process kicking in, and why the general meeting, as we know, will include kind of regulations and various aspects to try and pass motions that will allow them to kind of bypass this.
Because essentially it goes back to what I said in my earlier remarks, is that there is no desire from the Attanasio group at this stage, from Delia or Michael, for there to be a transfer of ownership in that regard. So, as you rightly said there, the takeover code mandates that he has to make an offer for the remaining shares, but clearly he doesn't want to go down that path, because he isn't looking to move beyond 40% threshold and mirror Delia and Michael at this stage. But unfortunately, because the takeover code stipulates that there has to be an offer mandatorily made to shareholders, what the process is now is that, from the club's point of view, is that they will put that to shareholders, that you have to essentially waiver your right, or agree to waiver your right to have an offer made for those shares, thereby allowing essentially Attanasio, Delia and Michael to move forward at the pace and kind of with the desire that they want to do, in terms of continuing almost just to keep learning about each other and developing that relationship. And then maybe further down the track, we get to that point where it is, a transfer of power. But for now, and it's worth stressing as well, because when this was explained to me, I'm thinking, in that scenario that you mapped out there, hypothetically, I've got two shares, I'm in the money here. I can offer. I
get a new hat or something like that.
I can, whatever. Yeah, I can charge, or I can say, well, yes, but you have to pay me X. Straight away, let's clarify that. No, what Mark Attanasio is obligated to do is make an offer at the highest price that he's paid for a share,
Yeah.
and we're led to believe, and I think the documentation is there, publicly available at Companies House. I've been told, but the most he's paid for a share is £25. So in that scenario, you said £40, £20, but it'd be £50.
Yeah.
And that applies to, apparently there's roughly 6,500 independent shareholders, i.e. not Delia, not Michael, not Mark Attanasio. So any of those shareholders, whatever whether it's one share, two shares, whatever, it's £25 per share is the maximum that Mark Attanasio is obligated to make you an offer for. So essentially nobody's going to get rich, I would have thought, in terms of those independent
Not unless you earn a lot.
shareholders, yeah, but I don't think they are, to that extent.
Yeah.
But it's out of the club's hands. They have to comply with the requirements legally of the Takeover Code, and as a result, what they're seeking to do essentially is put it to those shareholders, as they did with the allotment process earlier in the year, to vote on their right to waiver that offer, essentially, and that, if it's passed, which the club sincerely hope it will do, will allow then this kind of process to evolve at the pace that all the key parties in this, the Attanasios, Delia and Michael, would wish it to do. If it wasn't to pass, then they'd probably have to go back to the drawing board, because, essentially, to reiterate, Mark Attanasio is not willing at this stage to move to a position where he is the sole or the biggest shareholder and really hands on. We know we've heard it from Zoe, we've heard it from Stuart Webber at the end of last season. We know they are immersed in the club, and as we saw there, that picture behind us is taken from a recent away game at Southampton, where they were there with their family. He's regularly attending board meetings remotely,
and we're told having a pretty good presence in those as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was told that actually the interpersonal relationship with Stuart Webber is very good as well. That after every game, Stuart Webber and Mark Attanasio will talk. So they're fully immersed in it. But at this stage, to reiterate, they don't wish to take the reins, to use that term, from Delia and Michael.
And I think it's really important to map out this kind of takeover vote in a bit more detail, because, as we said, it's going to be put to shareholders. So I think it's important to kind of map out what this means. If I'm a shareholder walking into that meeting, because, as you say, was it February meeting last year was slightly different in that we were kind of expecting it to pass because Delia and Michael's vote, for example, had the majority sway. Yeah. So just explain to us why that necessarily won't be the case, and why it is probably a little bit more reliant on individuals to vote the way they wish to vote.
Yeah, that's a good point, Connor. Yeah, the reason being is that this vote, Delia's block of shares, Michael's block of shares, and Mark Attanasio's current block of shares, in terms of the vote process, they are deemed, for
obvious reasons. Yeah.
They are deemed to be, I think, in concert was the phrase I was explained. That's the legal term. It basically means, because it obviously relates to them, they have to take themselves out of the process. Zoe Webber, she's a director. Tom Smith is a director. They're deemed as independent directors in this process. They can vote on this, but the three main individuals involved, and obviously their huge block of current shares, they cannot be part of this equation. So that's why it's imperative that if it's going to pass, it's going to be on the independent shareholders, to use that phrase. The 6,500 or so smaller scale shareholders, and that is a fundamental difference from the process in February, because, as you rightly said, it carried really on the nod of Delia and Michael.
And individual shareholders as well will be thinking, okay, this is fine. And they'll obviously listen to what it means for the club more widely. Yeah. What does it mean for their shares? Is there a situation where, I don't know, they own a certain amount of shares and the value depreciates because of this vote? Is that a process that could happen, would happen? We know a lot of people maybe don't have shares for the reason of making financial gain anyway, so I guess people would have to make their own minds up on that. Yeah,
I'm not 100% sure in terms of whether it'll dilute their overall shareholding. I guess, and I'm coming at this from a very layman's perspective, but if you're injecting more shares into the overall mix, which they essentially are with the 194,000 vehicle, then that probably does mean the value of your actual nominal share goes down. But I wouldn't want to say definitively that is the case. But the other point is more relevant, I think, and certainly from the club's perspective, I get that sense that there's also a belief, I think, that, and Delia and Michael, you could never dispute that they've always felt that, and they've talked about it, they're the caretakers of the football club. They're not owners in that sense. They're fans, and they want that fan ownership element, maybe not ownership's the right word, but that fan shareholder input. They believe in that. We know, Delia has spoken passionately about, the direction of travel with a lot of English football and ownership, and how it's moving ever further away from fans, and particularly now as well, increasingly at the Premier League level, overseas companies, overseas countries even, and that's an anathema clearly to how Delia and Michael feel English football should be ran in terms of governance and ownership of football clubs, and that fan element. They still want to retain that. Apparently, Mark Attanasio is fully behind that as well. He believes in that element as well, the vitality of having that shareholder presence from rank and file supporters. One shareholder, two shareholder type operation. So I think that's a factor as well. As much as this is obviously about manoeuvring, hopefully, into the next phase of the relationship with Attanasio and the football club more broadly, they still do wish, because they're passionate about that fan element in terms of, a fan who's able to go to an AGM and have a say. And okay, in terms of voting rights, it's not quite on the scale of a Delia or a Michael or an Attanasio, but the theory is still there that you can go as a Norwich fan / shareholder to an AGM and hold these people to account and ask questions and be kept informed, obviously, of what's happening in terms of the financial direction and the key decisions being made and the people who are making those decisions, and hold that to account. That clearly, as we know, in a lot of other clubs now, certainly in the Premier League, isn't the case. And so I think they still want to retain that moving forward within the direction of travel that they're hoping to progress this.
Yes, and just to make the point as well on that actual meeting, a couple of points. There'll be a minimum of 3 weeks' notice for the actual meeting when the documentation lands. It's worth highlighting that. And then there will be an external party used to obviously count and verify the votes for the reasons that Paddy outlined. So it will be a fair process, so to speak, in case there are any undue concerns about that. So that's kind of the process and how we've got here. So I think it's worth looking to maybe what this means in the future, which is maybe the point that we've missed out, Paddy. Just in terms of the mechanics of this, as we said, this will, if it passes, and we expect if it does pass for those shares to be allotted pretty quickly because of obviously the long and lengthy process that this has been. Two-part question, really. I guess, A, do we know how much the overall cost for those shares is? And secondly, how will it affect the power relationships, I guess, at the top of Norwich City? How is this relationship between Mark Attanasio and Delia going to work? Because I think people are looking and you said parity, which is a good word to use, both on 40%. How does that actually materialise? How does that actually function in terms of running the football club?
It's two parts. First part, the financial element. We're led to believe that the cost that has been committed from Mark Attanasio for those 194,000 shares is around about $6 million. Mm-hmm. Obviously dollars, because that's his currency in terms of the accounting process. And what it would mean moving forward, that there is a really critical point to stress here. Because it's all right, okay, if you're a shareholder and you go to that meeting, either in person or via proxy, and waiver your right to that offer, and that goes through en masse, and then we have a situation beyond that where it is 40%. But it's the what next, isn't it? Okay. If you're a shareholder or a slash fan, you can accept that they're not ready to maybe progress this. In terms of a transfer of power, I keep using that phrase, right here, right now, but what is the longer-term roadmap almost? And from what I'm led to believe, as I say, just to reiterate, we are recording this prior to that announcement being made and the document landing on shareholders' doormats, and I'm led to believe it's a 28-page document packed with all sorts of legal jargon, which is why we felt we might be able to sort of
distill it, hopefully.
We'll let them be the judge of that. But within that 28 pages, as I understand it, that there will be some clarity around what next. Subject to this obviously hurdle being cleared. What does the what next look like? And apparently, there is a commitment from Mark Attanasio and his group that Delia and Michael would remain in control in the sense of the hand on the tiller is theirs still for a 3-year period, and that was backdated from January of this year. So where are we? So that's the start of 23. So for the next 3 years, there is a guarantee from the Attanasios, which I believe will be in this 28-page document.
That's an obligation, or that's an agreement that they've struck themselves? How does that?
From the mechanics of it is that he will essentially vote his shares in lockstep with what Delia and Michael wish on any given matter. And of course, you have to make a distinction between the shareholder matters, which could be like appointing directors, selling the club, those kind of more broad brush strokes, as opposed to votes around a board table, which might be appointing a head coach, appointing a sporting director. So there is a difference there. But in terms of the bigger picture, direction of travel, his votes, he will move those with Delia and Michael, whatever they wish for this next 3-year period.
Irrespective of subject as well.
Irrespective, yep. Okay. Because again, to reiterate, he doesn't wish to be in control at this point. He wants, for that financial commitment, to have obviously an increased shareholding, and why wouldn't you? I think that's understandable. But with that, he doesn't want to then be calling the shots, essentially. Yeah. On the board point, though, it is worth referencing that because he'll go above 30%, my understanding is that he will get another seat on the board. He will be able to put another person, whether it's a family member or a business partner, onto the board. So he would have essentially a double presence on the board. But to reiterate, boardroom votes are for matters of a head coach or a footballing personnel appointments kind of thing. That the actual direction of travel of the football club and all that goes with it, that they are distinct. They are shareholder matters. And to reiterate, for the 3 years starting from last January, because obviously this process began at the start of the year, essentially, he would vote in lockstep with Delia and Michael. So I think that in itself, that's probably more the practice. I mean, it's all right saying no, they're on the same page and they'll move forward together, but that actually gives some practical clarity to what that means in terms of day to day for the shorter term and maybe even into a little bit of the midterm.
Yeah, and I guess for Delia and Michael, it's a reassurance, isn't it, that he's not going to get 40% and suddenly throw weight around. Not that he would necessarily, but I guess there is that maybe that fear, which is again really interesting that you've kind of mapped that out. What does this mean? So we've got to a stage where there's parity, where Mark Attanasio is going to vote in lockstep with Delia and Michael on those issues that you mapped out, not necessarily around the board table, but in terms of maybe the motions that you see at AGMs primarily, that kind of thing is what we're talking about. What does this mean for him in the future? Because we've probably gone from, if you were to sort of narrow this down into phases, we've probably transitioned from phase 1 into phase 2. Where do you feel that the next phase is? Have we got a possibility, because this is what people will be knowing, you've used the word transfer of power, have we got the possibility where there is a transfer of power at some point? Is there a clear roadmap in terms of the next phase kicking in and Mark Attanasio becoming the primary sort of owner of Norwich City Football Club? What do you make of that being the kind of next step?
Well, I mean, you look at it and actually go back to the trigger events process, which was around the creation of those C preference shares in the first phase of this developing relationship. And there was a 7-year timescale put on that. Now we're talking in terms of 3 years, and we're probably halfway through that 3-year process in terms of the shareholder cooperation, collaboration. So, for me, there's quite clearly a timeline. I don't think it's been sketched in that on a certain date in a certain year, Mark Attanasio will be taking control. And Delia and Michael will, probably depart to I keep saying life president. That's just me purely hypothetically, blue sky finger. A more ceremonial presence,
which is what we've seen at other football clubs.
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
think you're just
So no, I don't think there's a date in mind. But, I mean, you take a step back and you look at this in the round, and we've gone from dipping a toe in the water and coming on the board and buying up some shares to now pretty much doubling the shareholder pot that he's got if this goes through successfully, with those C preference shares in the background as well. And it's the financial commitment. Again, it's another $6 million worth of investment on top of what he's already put into the club, on top of then what he paid for his Folger shares and those other little smaller share buy-ups. It very clearly signals that him and his family are in it for the longer term. And now I just go back to the parallels, which are obvious to draw, but his involvement with the Brewers, what's that now, 19 years and counting. So many parallels between how he initially moved into the Brewers, that they were family owned, I think, and he worked very closely with that family, and then eventually that there was a very orderly transfer of power, and he's still there now, him and his family, nearly 2 decades on. So I'm not saying it's going to be 20 years worth of Attanasio involvement at Norwich, but I think you only have to look at how he's developed his influence and his ownership reach at the Brewers, and now look at the same steps happening with Norwich to know that it's very clear that, as he said himself and his family have said, they've almost got the bug now, haven't they? They it's something probably more for the family that they can get into and involve themselves and immerse themselves in. It's not a hard-headed, pragmatic business decision, I don't think, to get involved with certainly an English football club, given the challenges to, particularly outside of the Premier League and the financial disparities. But it's under their skin. It clearly is, because we wouldn't be getting to this point now. And it is only really, I mean, like you said, it was May 22, was it, when they came out of the Premier League? Yeah. And we're August 23 now. So in a little over 12 months, and it would have even been quicker if they hadn't had to obviously go down the legal route with the takeover code. So in very short order, he's gone from 0 shares to potentially 40%. That tells you how committed he is. So, but it is worth stressing that, I don't think this is anything happening in the next 12 to 18 months for me. It's very clear.
Well, that's something I was going to ask, because we've mentioned about the kind of voting in lockstep and that agreement that they have. Is there anything within that agreement that would prevent that from happening in that similar time frame? Is there anything written in about that?
Written, I don't know. But for me, it's quite clear that the Delia, Mark Attanasio relationship is one that is rooted in a lot of mutual respect and understanding of both parties. Even the picture behind us, that game there, Southampton, I'm led to believe that was on the Saturday. Friday night, he's meeting Delia and Michael for dinner. So they have a personal relationship. They now have a professional relationship, and I would think it will change at the point when all parties are in agreement that it's the right time to change. I don't think quite clearly, by the commitments that Mark Attanasio is making in this latest cycle, there's no desire to aggressively edge Delia and Michael aside. Quite clearly, that isn't the case. So,
if that was the case, quite frankly, it probably wouldn't happen. Right?
No,
they'd be met with more resistance.
Of course, it would. Yeah, exactly. So, the fact that Delia and Michael are fully behind this process at every stage, that tells you they're very comfortable at the rate of pace that this is moving along with. And but who knows? We're sat here after a very positive championship start, and it all feels good and optimistic. But if we're still here next summer in the championship, then the financial implications of that will come clear, and at that point, then does it become imperative? As I say, I keep going back to the first early remarks about the last set of published accounts. They mapped out quite clearly there are some serious financial challenges now. That would only be magnified if there's another season in the championship. So I guess the financial backdrop may dictate how quickly this moves from here. But to reiterate, in the here and now, this is a very collaborative process still, and will remain so for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, let's end then by kind of recapping everything that we've spoken about in the last 33 minutes or so, because I think that's really important. I can see you've got a list of key points, which is going to be really helpful. But as we said, this is a process that was kick-started by Norwich, and I think that's worth to reiterate. It was the club who approached Mark Attanasio surrounding some financial help, I guess, at a better rate than maybe they would have got it at banks. It's a very difficult time to go and seek that at the moment. Like you said, they've already got loans out on future earnings, the cost of living crisis and everything else, and everything in the world, it seems in the world, but certainly in this country, increasing as well. The interest rates have gone north, and so this was a better way of financing that. Mark Attanasio said, yes, but I'll have some more shares, hence to the club creating the shares and creating this kind of financing route, which it is essentially. And so, as we discussed at the time, a really, I guess this is slightly different for the club, because the 22% from Folger and other shareholders, they were transactions between the two parties, weren't they?
Yeah.
This is actually a cash injection into the into the club's coffers and is immediate in that sense as well. So it benefits the club directly, whereas before it was individual. So that's kind of how this came about. Norwich, obviously, the process has taken so long because of the takeover code, which you mentioned, which because Mark Attanasio will be on 40%, this takes him above the 30% threshold that would basically mandate him to make an offer to all other shareholders at the rate, or at the highest rate that he's paid for a share, which, as we've said, is around and about £25. So shareholders will be called to a general meeting to vote on that and pass a motion that basically enables them not to do that, and for this to be passed regardless. And then that probably brings us up to point with some of the key things that you were going to talk about, Paddy, just to end, just the headline kind of notes and figures on this as well, just to round off and recap the debate so everyone kind of leaves knowing exactly where they're at.
Yeah, well, I mean, point probably we do need to draw out, because it is a relevant one, is that, you know, the club would love, as I understand it, to be able to communicate maybe in less formal legal jargon, and they actually explored that with the caseworkers that are involved in terms of the takeover code, and that isn't an option to them. That's why that 28-page document, as I'm told it will be, that drops, is very heavily legal jargon about the intricacies from a regulatory process. So that's the first point, that because they're not able to do that, you know, we've been able to maybe add a little bit more of a nuance to that documentation. But essentially, I mean, just to add the point that you've made there, Connor, that is very much where the club would like to take this process. But in order to do that, they clearly need shareholders to waiver their right to that mandatory offer, because if they don't, then obviously then the alternative is that, you know, they can't progress down the path they wanted to do, which was 40%. Presumably those shares wouldn't then be allotted, and they'd have to go back to the drawing board and obviously speak again to Mark Attanasio and Delia and Michael and try and work out another way of doing that. But if that process does go through, as they hope it will do, for the reasons we've outlined, then I guess it does give a bit more clarity to the future direction and travel of the football club, and the fact that it will be 40%, 20% of the remaining shareholders, with those commitments and those guarantees from Mark Attanasio and his group that for the next 2.5 years, at least, they will vote in lockstep with Delia and Michael on any shareholder-related matters. But obviously, you know, clearly, as we discussed in the previous section, there is an inevitability, I think, just looking at all the elements in this current cycle, that we will be moving at some point in the future to potentially Mark Attanasio taking another step forward, Delia and Michael taking a step back, and then, you know, we're into a different phase again. But in the here and now, where we're at today, is that shareholders are being asked to essentially facilitate the next stage as the club would like it to progress, as they've mapped it out, as they try to, you know, create a vehicle in terms of the shareholder mix, but at a pace that is, with Delia, Michael and Mark, you know, in very, very an agreeable kind of pace to that. So, you know, that's essentially where we are, and it has been quite a frustrating wait, inevitably, but maybe there's a bit more of an understanding now that, you know, a lot of that really was out of the club's control. But I think what would happen, subject to that general meeting returning the result that they would hope, is that allocation will happen very swiftly off the back of that, and then we are then into that next phase of, you know, no longer a majority-owned club, which is quite a seismic change, given that Michael and Delia, for the 20 years or so they've been in charge, have been in charge in terms of owning the football club, with obviously the caveat that they kind of balk at that phrase. They don't like to be seen as owners in that sense, rather caretakers and custodians with fan representation. And that, as a last point, is something that they still believe passionately in, as did Mark Attanasio, and they wish that to continue moving forward. And you can see that, I guess, in the sense that for this to move forward, it needs those individual shareholders, the 6,500 or so, to be in agreement and to move forward together with the football club.
Yes, and they just need a simple majority for it to pass as well. So that is where we are. Hopefully the last 40 minutes or so has been useful, and we haven't spoken in complete jargon that you don't understand what's going on. We've tried to make it as simplistic and as clear as we can, but this is in essence the next stage of the process in terms of Mark Attanasio's involvement in the football club. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any comments off the back of this, feel free to get in touch with us. Feel free to comment under the YouTube video. We will try and answer them if we can and if we have the capability to, which may be more the point, but we'll do our best. There'll be plenty obviously of written stuff around this as well, which will maybe map it out if you work it a little bit easier in terms of taking information in that way as well. So hopefully that's been useful. Thank you to Paddy. Thank you all you guys for watching and listening. And it's a seismic day for Norwich City Football Club.